Been wanting to record this episode for a little while, and honestly, I've been putting it off because this one is quite personal. Today, I'm sharing my story, not as a coach, not as an expert, not as an educator, just as a mum who was completely lost, who didn't have the language for what was happening with her own family, and who eventually found a way through. If you've ever felt like you're failing, like you're the problem, like you've tried everything and nothing works, this one is for you. You are in exactly the right place.
Welcome to the Attuned Spectrum podcast. I'm Chantal Hewitt, an ADHD mum, experienced educator, and autism support coach who understands your path because I also walk it daily. This is your space for real conversations that empower your autistic child, yourself, and your family to thrive. Here, we respect neurodiversity, cheer on advocacy, and leave judgment at the door. Join me inside this week's episode.
I'd like to start with part one. This is before I had the language. We were first-time parents. This was our first child. As you do with your first child, you are so engaged and all consumed by everything that they do. And you second guess a lot of things, and you may be a little bit anxious, and you just try to make sense of what's in front of you and do the right thing for your child. There was something different, and even though I worked with children for over 10 years already, I couldn't pinpoint it. And it was really hard because my son's language development from about 15, 16, 17 months was phenomenal. And I think you don't actually hear the opposite of what happens in child development. They talk about what you should be noticing if they are lacking a certain amount of words, but they don't really talk about what happens if they have an incredible amount of language and clarity, for example, from such an early age. And that's what we were experiencing with our child. And because that wasn't really a red flag to pediatricians, doctors, our families, we just assumed that all was okay. And then the meltdowns happened. And I'm talking such intense meltdowns that over the years, over our boys' young years, turned to panic attacks and panic episodes, 3 to 4 hours long a day. And as you watch your child go through that, it is hard and it is exhausting, and you're just trying to do the absolute best for them without actually having a roadmap of what that is, which probably was the hardest part. I think for us, around 2 or just before 2, we noticed sensory differences to the point where we were Googling sensory processing disorder. And we were Googling, I think, as you do as parents, looking at that hyperactivity and going, oh, is this ADHD? What does ADHD look like in such a young child? Because you cannot diagnose ADHD till closer to 7. And also knowing that he was a boy. And generally speaking, boys' energy can be a little bit more, as they say, or as they've told us, or as the books told us. Something that I remember that we couldn't pinpoint what was causing this behavior in my son or this reaction in my son, what he was communicating, because he had such great language. Like he could say massive sentences and really express himself from such a young age that when we were trying to make sense of his sensory experiences, it became really challenging. But one thing that stands out is we would be in our lounge in our living room and he would put his hands over his ears and yell, "Stop talking." And we couldn't figure out why, because we weren't being loud. He himself was an extremely loud child when he wanted to be. But of course, it doesn't matter because he was the one in control of that. But yeah, for the longest time, we were going, what does this mean? Even when we were being quiet, or even if we were whispering in a different room, he would lose his mind. And it wasn't just, hey, I'm mad and I'm going to yell. It was, this is going to send me into a full-blown meltdown for hours on end. And we just had to ride the wave. And now looking back, so it did take us a few years until we realized PDA and learned more about PDA. And that kind of kickstarted the whole journey for us. The biggest thing that stood out to me when I was Googling PDA and I guess developing my own expertise in that area as I was working with a lot of autistic, ADHD, neurodivergent children and supporting their families in education, it was this demand avoidance, but that led to panic or that led to running away or that led to aggression that was so not typical for the child unless they were dysregulated. And I started piecing together so many experiences that our son was having and how everything within the day was a demand. Whether it was intentional or not, it was a demand. And once we realized, hey, we think this could be PDA, because we were at wit's end. My husband and I, it was really, really hard. We understood PDA when we understood equalizing behavior, when we understood that this was a nervous system difference, a nervous system shift happening when his autonomy was compromised or when he didn't have control. That was the big one. One of the things was the monopolizing of play and specific to our PDA boy. And I know there's this shared characteristic among a lot of PDA children is that there is a want or a need to socialize or to have friendships. It doesn't mean that they are not more introverted or that they have different communication styles. A lot of PDA children do fall within the autism spectrum. The research is still coming out there. However, that is quite a common overlap. And if you do actually want more details on that, head on over to episode 24 with PDA North America, where they actually unpack this in detail with their PDA experience report. So yes, please head on there if you are interested in that topic specifically. But here for this, the monopolizing play, the needing to be in control or panic happened, the rigidity, absolute rigidity, which is an autistic trait and a part of my son's neurotype as well. But it wasn't just that if the routines were in place, it was okay for him. It wasn't that, like a lot of other autism strategies that are helpful, if there's a visual schedule in place, predictability, then that rigidity, that need for sameness is supported and that predictability is supported because what we noticed was my son was still really dysregulated if he didn't come up with the schedule himself or if it wasn't something that he was so invested in. Novelty as well. We noticed that that novelty, that dopamine hit really was an indicator for us that, hey, this works. If we switch things up, he's really into it. But then the novelty wears off really quick, which is another PDA trait. And the one that I will always remember where everything clicked was and I'm quoting here, but like the social strategies or getting out of things, because he would tell such elaborate stories and be so into a story that he told to avoid something so simple or what we thought was so simple. So if we said, hey, let's go grab our shoes, it would be 30 minutes of what someone might call excuses, but it just didn't make sense. And then the other one was, I had read a lot of PDA children, they will say, my limbs don't work. So my arms are broken. My feet are glued to the floor. My leg just snapped and therefore I can't do what you're asking me. So it was really elaborate. It was how he was able to quote unquote get out of something, but that something was actually the demand that was causing his anxiety and his overwhelm. So once we pieced that together, that's when PDA became so paramount. And funny enough, even though we had autism in our mind, PDA was probably more at the forefront, which happens with a lot of autistic children who are PDA, because the differences that are seen in their communication, their ability to mask or their need or want to mask to fit in is sometimes really like that much higher than a non-PDA child. So it's almost like PDA got in the way of us fighting for his autism diagnosis. And even to this day, when we tell people that our son's autistic, let alone most of our family, they're shocked because what they see is the mask. They see a child forcing themselves. And this isn't something that, we encourage or that we're proud of, but this is that power of the mask. And from such a young age, and I'm talking this was 3, 4, even 2, that he was masking and people pleasing and trying to comply and fit in to hide his natural tendencies. But then you could see it, which is very PDA as well. The second that they are with their co-regulator, which was me, it was full shutdown, full meltdown, explosion, that after school collapse. It was so intense and it lasted for hours and hours and hours. So that's the trajectory of how we realized PDA within our son. And I do want to mention the part about meltdowns. This wasn't just tantrums, and I even hate that word, being a professional in the space. I don't believe that any child has a tantrum. I honestly believe that it's how they're communicating and that is quite a negative way that we look at supporting a child's communication, because even adults have tantrums, quote unquote, if we really want to put it that way. It is really hard to self-regulate and to communicate with other people when everyone has different ways of communicating. But yeah, these weren't tantrums, quote unquote. They were panic attacks, panic episodes, and they were hours, and nothing would pull him out of it except for eventually building back up his autonomy. And it wasn't, I'm giving in and I'm doing this, because a lot of the times when he was so dysregulated, that wouldn't work either. And there was no roadmap of how to help him, and honestly, how to help ourselves as parents. I think the second part that I want to speak to is, if it's relevant for those who are listening, is if you then have a second child, or wherever, actually, however many children you have. In our case, it was our first post PDA. But there's a new layer that gets added when it's not just the parents and the child, or if you're a single parent and the child who's neurodivergent. It is then integrating into more family systems. And what does that look like when there is a second child or a third child or an infant, when your PDA child or your neurodivergent child is seeking autonomy or seeking control, or has behavior that is so troubling as a parent to watch or to manage. My second child was, I hate to say it, like hit in the face multiple times a day. And by multiple, I mean like double digits multiple for the first 8 months, pretty much, of his life. And it was so confusing and so hard to understand why his brother was doing this. And that was another thing, is just, it just didn't make sense. Like the behavior that we were seeing in our young child at this age, he would have been about 2 to 3. It was it just wasn't goal oriented, which is normally that behavioral part that you see or that you hear of, is that there's, a reason why they're doing something. But even he didn't know. And it was just so confusing because we didn't know when it was going to come. We tried to prevent it as much as possible. Then you actually feel like you're failing your poor second child, or who, in our case, second child, but it could be anybody. But yeah, that how that fits in and how you support different neurotypes within your family, that is a whole other layer that we have to factor in. So supporting you in your journey as a parent of a PDA child or a neurodivergent child, an autistic child, it is not one size fits all. It is not something you can read in a textbook and then fully apply to your life and your situation. Yes, some of it might be helpful, but in the moment, in reality, that textbook wasn't written about your family. That's why individualized support and care is so important. So around, when our child was about three and a bit, his teachers started noticing things too. Question PDA, struggles with toileting. We talked about interoception and the awareness that may or may not be there for him. So around that time, just after 3, as parents, we started pushing for answers, and we were quite annoyed by the professionals speaking to our child, or even if he wasn't speaking to them, when we would describe his language, his vocabulary, his ability to understand numbers and problem solve in his head, or physically like manipulating materials, they would brush us off. And that was so not validating for us as parents, when you're doing everything you can to understand why the emotional needs of your child are being left behind by professionals who just don't understand, but who should understand. That's a whole other topic. But every single professional, except for his teacher, I will say, but everyone would say, here is behavior support. Here's a behavior program. Have you tried motivating his behavior? Have you tried this? Have you tried that? Or even, he's not struggling academically, so we don't need to worry. But how awful to hear if you are a parent just barely managing to get through your day, and that is the advice that you are met with, of, that's okay because he might be able to do math really well. Well, that's great, but what if he can't get into a classroom? What if he can't approach a teacher when he needs help? What if he can't express himself the way that he wants to appear to a friend? What if he wants friendships and doesn't really know how to make them because he lives in a world where neurotypical societal norms end up being the dominant reality for him? And those are the things that we fight for. And that is why we fought for an autism diagnosis. So for me, labels aren't a bad thing. They actually mean everything, because they offer him support. And I know, speaking to that, there are a lot of families who struggle to get a label or get a diagnosis. So I'm really grateful that we were able to. But if you are in that space and you are thinking, gosh, a diagnosis isn't on the cards for us, it's not accessible, please know that you can still get support even if you don't have whatever label. Trust yourself, trust how you know your child, and you can still support them. So every single professional, everyone, here's the behavior program. Have you tried this? Oh, don't worry, it'll get better. Well, actually, no, it's not going to get better if you're giving my PDA child, demand avoidant child who has a nervous system disability, an approach that significantly makes things worse and puts him at risk of feeling safe in his body and in his emotional well being. So we just knew in our gut that that was not the right thing to do and that it was actively making things worse. And we just kept pulling and pulling at these things and trying them. And the only thing that worked was low demand parenting strategies and a complete overhaul of our parenting approach. I think what's probably most frustrating is that we work alongside professionals who we hope would have the answers and they don't a lot of the time. It is so hard to find PDA affirming, even neurodiversity affirming, like truly neurodiversity affirming professionals to support families who are asking for help. And that is not necessarily their fault. It is the system's fault. Our systems are really far behind. And unfortunately, we are navigating systems that aren't built for our children or built for our families. And just after our son turned 4, we finally got his autism diagnosis and we had to go private, which was fine. But I remember the pediatrician looked at me and he almost said it like whispering. And he was like checking to see if I was okay. But I could just feel like tears coming. And he was like, I'm so sorry. We can find a way to manage your child. And I was like, no, I was like, that's not why I'm crying. I'm crying because even though no one else gets it, that's the validation that I have been searching for and that we needed because now we have, yes, it's a label, but I firmly believe and advocate that that label needs to be reshaped by the autistic community. It needs to be strength-based. Autism isn't a deficit. And I was so proud of our family for fighting for that. And I still am. And we talk about it with our children and they know what autism is because it's part of their brain. It is their brain. It's my brain. So yeah, that was a big moment of validation. That was only part of it because then PDA comes into play and even then they don't understand. But that validation is what made the biggest difference for me as a mum. And that is what I strive through my communities and through my coaching work to offer families because I can give you every strategy. I could point you in the direction of every low demand parenting book or low demand strategy or declarative language and run all the workshops, which I still do. But the biggest change comes from what I've seen and what I've experienced and kind of collectively what our community has created together is not being isolated, having people that you don't need to explain yourself to, who just get it and who come together on a regular basis to be there for each other, whether that is a video call, whether that is just reading a message, or whether it's just a like of a post. But that community, that validation has made so many shifts in the parents that I support, even in myself. It continues to help lift me up and support me in my parenting. Yeah, after my son's diagnosis, then there was mine. And I know a lot of parents realize their neurodivergence through their children. And it is a huge shift in thinking, a big journey to go on as a parent, as a person. And when you're a mother and you're dealing with all these hormones, so if you're female or assigned female at birth, and you have all of your hormones that shift and change throughout your life. And I will say this, that hormones are not an area at all of my expertise. I'm just speaking to my own experience with them and how I understand my intersecting neurodivergence. But when my third child was born, my executive functioning was gone. I was in the biggest burnout, something that I've had repeated episodes of exhaustion over and over and over again, multiple times in my life, especially since having children and having those hormonal changes and shifts. But I reached my capacity and I couldn't function. And I was in educational leadership. I managed a team. I was go, 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 which I now realize was my ADHD, my hyperactivity. and I couldn't sit still. My brain couldn't sit still. And I had this hyperfixation and this intense passion for, hey, quick pause. If you're listening to this and thinking, this is my life, I just want you to know there's more support available. I work with families at a few different levels, from communities all the way through to one-on-one coaching. You don't need to figure out which one is right for you. Just come find me on Instagram at chantel.hewitt and send me a DM. Tell me what's going on for you and your family, and we'll go from there. Okay, back to it. Learning as much as I could in my area of interests, came to the point where ADHD was so in my face and I'd never considered it before. I'd actually, funny enough, like in job interviews, you get that question of what made you want to teach or what made you want to do what you want to do? And my answer, it was always like it wasn't something I ever had to script. It was always so genuine. And now I realize that the reason why I have such passion for supporting the children that I do, the ones who have those quote unquote challenging behaviors or who are misunderstood, or whether they're diagnosed or not, whether they're autistic, ADHD, PDA, if they're anxious, anything like that, any child that doesn't fit the norm or that a parent is exhausted and struggling. Even when I wasn't a parent yet, I always just answered this question being like, I'm not sure. I always just feel connected to these children and I don't know why. And my diagnoses, they have given me an explanation of my why. It was because I was a missed neurodivergent child. No fault of my parents, different times. But I guess I was always trying to support children in a way that I felt I was never seen. And that is a big reason why I do as well the work that I do and why I advocate. Because if we don't know, then how are we meant to support our neurodivergent children? So my son's diagnosis, funny enough, led to me understanding myself differently, peeling back layers, peeling back a mask. And what first was an ADHD realization, I received my adult diagnosis at 34, and that was after my third child was born. And then once I tried medication, and that was a life-changing moment, by the way, absolutely life-changing. I was never someone who would be, I guess, open for whatever weird reason to accept medication. But I just came to a point where I couldn't function. I couldn't make my family dinner. I was just in paralysis on the couch. Like I would just be running on adrenaline. And it was just so different than burnout. And I was sick of being told that I'm an overachiever or that I have high expectations or that I'm too much and need to slow down because my brain was different and I just never realized it. So with my ADHD, my dopamine levels in my brain being supported through medication, my autistic traits became very loud and very apparent. So my mind was a bit quieter, but then I noticed a lot of sensory differences that I guess I'd always had, but I just pushed aside or used adrenaline to push myself through. So funny enough, in which actually through research I've realized is really common, there is a big overlap there or co-occurrence in ADHD and autism. But a lot of times for women, especially late diagnosed women, ADHD traits mask autistic traits. And that was so eye-opening for me. So then I began to understand my autistic side and then connected on a different level with my son because I understood myself more. And then I realized PDA. And it's funny because you think of the word pathological demand avoidance, and this might need a whole other episode in itself to share that because it's still something that I think I carry some shame around, probably because of that terrible deficit language of pathological demand avoidance. Because when I think of it for me, it sounds like I am bad or disrespectful or, yeah, I guess raging against systems. And that's not what it is. PDA for me is like hitting a brick wall every single day, despite wanting to do something, despite having the energy to do something, despite knowing that it's something I love doing. I just can't do it. And that is so hard to explain because it seems so counterintuitive to someone who wants to do something. But that's probably the simplest way that I can say it without possibly sounding quite silly. But I will say that understanding how my own need for autonomy and control needs to be supported in my life, especially now that I've realized my executive functioning capacity or lack thereof and how to support my neurodivergence. Yeah, that understanding for myself as a parent has been life-changing. And I know that if you're listening, you aren't necessarily neurodivergent, but you could be. And I don't say that because I'm telling you that you are. I'm saying it because if there was ever something in your head that may be telling you that you are, or that there are differences, or you may be looking at the criteria as your child is going through diagnosis or assessment, and you might be thinking, gosh, this is me, or oh, that sounds familiar. Maybe hold on to that because maybe you are. And I bring this back to everything that I teach within the community, within my coaching programs, whether that's one-on-one or group work, is if you are not okay as a parent, as a person, in how you're regulated in your nervous system, everything, notoriously much harder for neurodivergent people, let alone women in motherhood who are struggling with hormonal shifts and differences there. Please know that if you are struggling, a diagnosis or even support in that area or understanding a little bit more about yourself could actually be life-changing for you, which means that that flow on, that carry on effect will shift within your child and your family. So just a little note there if you want to consider that, if it resonates with you. So yeah, it may not be relevant, but that missing piece for me was my own neurodivergence. And once I had that piece of the puzzle, everything started to fit into place. And even if you aren't neurodivergent or you don't think that you are, how you come to show up for your child as their co-regulator, it matters. Are you regulated? How are you feeling in your emotions? Those things still matter. I do want to end with just saying that I'm not here showing up as someone who has figured this out just from the outside. Like there is that professional work there, and I have training, and I find it extremely helpful when I'm making sense of child development, psychology, also the gaps within our academic systems, but that's a story for a different day. But I have those trainings, those understandings, and I'm telling you that my biggest understanding has actually come because I am here showing up as someone who has lived this, who is still living it, and who's found a way through that's worked for our family, and sharing that knowledge with other mothers or other co-regulators of their children. I've seen such amazing transformations. So this space, if you're listening, if you're still listening after this whole longer episode, this space that I've created is for exhausted parents who are navigating parenting their neurodivergent children or neurodivergent families, mothers or caregivers who are done with strategies that just don't fit their child. And in their body, in their bones, they know that. If you are here because you just want to be understood or feel validated, or if you've been searching for someone who gets it, not just professionally, but personally as well, I hope that this feels like you've landed in the right place because you really don't have to keep doing this alone. If this episode resonated and you may be craving a moment of genuine calm or reflection, I recorded a short audio meditation just for parents, just for you to settle you in and ground you if you need a little bit of guidance in a hard moment. It is free. I will link it below in the show notes. I hope you download and I hope you listen. Stick around for the next episode where I will be walking you through some of the biggest mindset shifts that I work with daily within the community, within the families that I work with. This is an episode that you will not want to skip.
Thank you so much for allowing me into your world today. Wherever you are around the globe, if you like what you've heard, I would be so grateful if you would click that subscribe button and comment below to tell me one thing. What support do you need? This helps me create episodes that truly impact our shared community. By commenting, you not only help yourself, but you help make modern, neurodiversity-affirming autism support accessible to those who are searching for a better parenting approach that actually feels good. I'm Chantel, and I'll see you next week.